The World Wide Web has always been about connections. First, it was simple links connecting web pages. Nowadays, it's knowledge graphs connecting repositories of semantically described content entities. Yep, that's a mouthful. Andrea Volpini can help you understand these concepts. Andrea has been working with semantic web content for years. He structures content to add meaning that shows computers, including search engines like Google, what the information you publish means and how it relates to other content on the web.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 79 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Andrea Volpini. Andrea is the founder and the CEO of a company called WordLift. And we're going to talk about the kind of activities that WordLift does. But first of all, welcome to the show, Andrea, and tell the folks a little bit about WordLift and what you do there.
Thanks, Larry. I'm really excited to be on the show today. WordLift is originally started as a plugin for WordPress and now is evolving outside of WordPress and helps people create knowledge graph. And the purpose of this knowledge graph is to improve the content visibility over search engines like Google. So in a way, you can think of us as an advanced SEO tool.
Got it. And I think that's a common way that people come to structured data and knowledge graphs and things like that is through a concern about being found on the web. But there's a whole other aspect to it as well. There's this, Tim Berners-Lee gave this famous TED talk about in 2009, I think, about his vision for the evolution of the web and how it would be more connected than it is, so that rather than having these siloed databases and content repositories, you could share things more openly. And that kind of gets into like what your technology really helps with is getting on the open web and one of there's sort of a very closely related idea, this idea of the semantic web. So could you talk a little bit about the open web and the semantic web, how they fit together?
So in Tim Berners-Lee world, I would say just raw data now. That was, the presentation that you mentioned, it kind of ended up with this mantra about releasing raw data. And if you think about it, it's still, so much valuable right now as a statement, especially because now, artificial intelligence so deeply relies on semantically rich data. So what is the semantic web? That's what we have to, start from. And as I was saying, semantic web is really, in a simple terms, the connection between a document and a database. And traditionally it's been seen as something very complex, but in reality, semantic web is just, the simplest way in which you can encode knowledge for a computer to understand it. And how do you encode information? How can you kind of describe the fact that, Andrea is talking with Larry on a podcast? How can a machine understand this? And the simplest way is that we do it with triples. So we have, the subject of Andrea, and then we have the subject of Larry, and then we can connect them because, they're having this interview today. And so we generate triples as we describe the world that we live in a way that the machine can understand it. That's the semantic web. That's it. Simple as that.
Yeah, and that's typically diagrammed just like two little nodes, Andrea, a little dot, Larry, a little dot, and then a node connecting them. And that's kind of what the web is all about, like connections. And the thing that really drives the web is links. And in fact, when you build these triples, each of those entities has a unique resource identifier that says what it is, so that you know that this is an entity, that's an entity, here's how they're connected. And knowledge graphs are just like a huge way of that happening, right? Is that
right? And if you think about it, what is bringing the information? What really conveys the information in this, diagram that you described is the relationship, right? So the relationship, meaning the arch that connects the edges, is what is creating, the information that it's needed to describe, the fact that we're having this podcast. So semantic web is about creating a different web than the web of pages that we're used to. And it's a web of data. It's a web of meanings. So in this web of meanings, we just build relationships. And the reason we do this is that we want machine to understand, the content that we care about. That's the reason why we build these links.
Right, and it's the links just both within your website that kind of helps other people understand how you organize your content. But there's the real power in this is the links to other websites and to services like Google to return things like search results. For example, one of the things I think that SEOs are really concerned with now is showing up in like featured snippets or knowledge graph display, knowledge panels, or those various new just things that Google does. Can you talk a little bit about how doing this, how behaving in a semantic way on the web helps you get found more easily?
Simple as that. I mean, you can just trigger my name, Andrea Volpini, on Google, and you can see that that the brand SERP related to Andrea Volpini, it's composed of different elements, and these elements drive most of the experience from the data in the Google Knowledge Graph. And by publishing data as linked data, I'm feeding, the way in which Google sees me. And so that's really the way in which we do marketing these days, is by creating data and linking data. Now, there is a problem with this approach that, of course, if we only look at creating data as something that we do for Google, then we kind of limit ourselves, and the scope of the entire, semantic web kind of sounds limited. I had to deal with this because I started from the semantic web, and then all of a sudden I realized that I was building an SEO tool, and we discovered it by chance. I never thought about SEO as something that would relate to semantic web technology and knowledge graph, but all of a sudden it became evident as Google was becoming more persistent in using the semantic technology stack. So now we have this reality where really, a tool like WorldLift that creates knowledge graph, it's an SEO tool, which is totally okay for me, and it works well. But is this the end of it? Probably not.
Right, because there's one possible consequence of all of this is that the more people create open, accessible data, and that other people might figure out ways to connect that in better ways than Google does. Because right now we're doing it just to curry favor with Google, but there's a nice, delicious potential irony in there that very mechanism might give others the opportunity to use these graphs to a different intent and purpose.
That's correct. So the gatekeeper, it is Google in the world of web pages, and it is still Google in the web of data today. But we can see that, as artificial intelligence gets democratized, more solution will come forward and might provide, different gatekeeping services for the users. So now there is a very interesting debate about, the role of Google in schema.org and the role of Google in the, development of the semantic web. My personal opinion is that Google has helped us bringing this forward, because, there's no other way around it. But right now, doing marketing using data, it means that you are creating a different way in which you can connect to your audience, and this can be through the Google Assistant, but it can be also through Alexa search, or it can go through Bing. I mean, there are different interfaces already among the big tech companies, and a lot more it's coming from God knows what companies.
Right. Well, and you just hit on something that I think is maybe one of the underlying behavioral things on the web that has driven a lot of this interest in structured data and knowledge graphs and things is the rise of, well, first, like 10, 12 years ago, it was mobile, and the desire and the need to kind of respond to that. So this responsive web and other technologies and practices arose from that. But with the rise of voice and other kinds of, and the whole Internet of Things and all kinds of gadgets and devices asking the internet for information, we have this whole new thing. Anyhow, can you talk a little bit about how this shift from the shift away from pages to more like entities and other ways of looking at this information helps with things like voice search and voice retrieval and things like that. Yeah.
So once again, you know, I use myself as an example, but not because I think I'm interesting, but quite the opposite, because I think I'm a very common person, and there are other, you know, most well-known Andrea Volpini on the web, and so, you know, by providing more data and creating entities that connects one to another, we provide machines with ways to interact with our content. So you can go out and ask on a Google Assistant, you know, who is the CEO of WordLift? And then you will get the response that the CEO of WordLift is Andrea Volpini. And would this bring a link to my page? Would I get traffic, or Google will just, you know, get the response to the user? Does it really matter, you know, in the business model of tomorrow? Because in the business model of today, it's a big issue, right? If Google is kind of capturing these links, it's a big issue. But is it Google really capturing all these links? Because my personal experience is that, yes, on a general scale, there are less organic opportunity. That's a fact. It's becoming more complicated. This is because the machine is becoming more intelligent. So if before we would have, you know, maybe 20 search engine result page where we could compete with the content, now maybe we have 2. Right? Because the machine is understanding the synonyms, and it's understanding, you know, the intent behind different queries. And if the intent is the same, the search might be similar. So we have, you know, less results being shown. And so the organic opportunity are actually less. But if I then look at, you know, people that are building data like us, and of course, there is an entire industry working in this direction, then you see that, you know, these clicks are actually improving years over years. I mean, we are talking about, you know, three figures increases in a market where we have, you know, 9% less organic opportunities. So how can this be possible? The more data we provide to the machine, the more opportunities we have of creating an interaction. And then, of course, you know, there is a dialogue that needs to happen between the different parties. I mean, do I want to share this data with Google? Will it be beneficial for me to do it? Or is it better if I keep it on my own? Because, I mean, open data doesn't mean free data, right? So we can define the boundaries of what we want to give as part of the open data web and what we want to keep as part of, you know, premium content that my users might want to see behind a subscription or whatever content model we're running. So I think we are really kind of in an evolving scenario where the business model it's becoming more intriguing than just, you know, clicks and sessions.
Right. It's much more subtle. And one of the things that drives that is a term that you just mentioned, and I want you to elaborate on a little bit, because I'm not sure that all of my listeners will know it. That notion of user intent and satisfying like a search intent or another user behavior that's intent that's on there. Can you talk a little bit about how structured data and you know, and the semantic, you know, attaching semantic meaning to information helps satisfy that intent?
Right. I mean, so imagine that you are looking for, you know, the query that we discussed before, the CEO of WordLift. You don't know the name, you just know the company, and so you say CEO of WordLift. And it is only possible through structured data that Google is able to disambiguate a query like CEO of WordLift with the intent of someone looking for the page of Andrea Volpini, the CEO of WordLift. So Google is able to understand the intent behind the query because we are, you know, feeding Google with a lot of data that helps, you know, create a, you know, disambiguate properly the entities behind. So, you know, a query like CEO of WordLift will be augmented by the search engine with what is called a synthetic query. So kind of a query that the machine creates in order to improve the results by generating the terms to be searched. So Google will create a synthetic query for Andrea Volpini when the user will search for CEO of WordLift. And it's only possible because I'm creating the relationship between WordLift and Andrea Volpini, and the relationship is CEO. So this arc that it's connecting, my company with my entity, it's what is providing Google with the ability to properly disambiguate a query like Seo Org in the intent Andrea Volpini, and to feed, data from his index that is related to the right Andrea Volpini.
Right, and that's that's the value of the service that Google offers. But it seems like a lot of other people could offer that. And now, you just mentioned, like you just said, that one of the things that drives that is, I assume that there's a lot of machine learning and ensuing artificial intelligence at Google that grows from all this data that we're feeding it. But with the open web, other people can access this data as well. Are there any other players out there now, like the beginning of maybe some kind of a breach of Google's dominance in controlling this kind of information? Or
I think at this point we're still in a phase where we need to produce data, right? So the data consumer are still very limited to the big tech companies, and that's a fact. We have to deal with the fact that the consumer of this data are still, the large organization. But things are changing very fast. So the name entity recognition that WorldLive uses, it's based on the data that it's linked inside DBpedia and inside Wikidata. So really any company now can do natural language processing for whatever purpose using this data. And that has a phenomenal impact if you think about it. Because if I'm making my data available in Wikidata to let people know that, let's say I'm managing a company, or I run, an SEO software tool, I am providing, a lot of people with the ability to understand everything that relates to my, knowledge domain, whether small or large.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about, you just used the term natural language processing, which is, if you could talk just a little bit to kind of define that and talk about how Google and others use natural language processing to, because that's one of the things that helps disambiguate like your name and your title and all that kind of stuff, right?
Right. Well, it also helps create the triples that you want to have for transforming a document into a graph that a machine can understand. So the role of the natural language processing is revolutionary in a way that allows machine to understand the unstructured content that we have published online. So it's a true revolution, because I can read all the tweets about you and understand what are the topics that you're discussing, but I can also read a web page about my company and understand what the company does. And well, Google is doing this, yes, but can we all do it? We can. I mean, it's super accessible. And it's becoming accessible as we have more data. So we're still in a phase where it's hard to say, who's going to be the next gatekeeper. So I don't have the answer for that now, but I can see that there is a momentum now in building and creating data. And I'm not afraid of the fact that, Google is taking most of the advantage of this data, as long as the publisher are in control. The problem I have is that sometimes publishers don't have control of their data. So they just publish web pages, and then someone arrives and gets these unstructured data, builds a graph for them, and then resells the metadata one way or another. And that creates kind of an asymmetric situation. Now, also Google is asymmetric in most of the, in some of the area of its business model, but at least has empowered this revolution. So yeah.
That's really, I think that's an important point for people who are listening, who are new to this whole idea that, like, if you don't create a knowledge graph about your content, somebody else will, and they'll benefit from it. That kind of gets into this notion, if you might have heard a lot of people talking about content as an asset. And it's really, the content, but it's equally, if not more important, is the metadata about that content. Is that a correct way of looking at it?
Now, if you think about it, if Google wouldn't have played, such a significant role in the, evolution of the schema.org markup, it would be very difficult today to prove the ROI of what you just said. So right now I can go to a client and say, hey, your content is an asset. and I can measure, the impact on the business of the content that they are producing because of Google. Now, I don't want to limit myself to Google, because then, of course, I can use this graph and I can then start measuring. When we build a knowledge graph, the first thing that we show, so the first level of the return of the investment would be the impact on SEO and search. So we can measure clicks, we can measure improvement on the click-through rates, we can measure findability in terms of more queries being captured by the content, or even better queries. So maybe you might get even less traffic with structured data, but that would convert more. So that would be the first kind of layer of the return of the investment. Then I will start to say, hey, what can we do with this data? Can we build a recommendation system using our knowledge graph that would allow people to stay longer on our site and to get back less on Google? Can we do that? Because that's the next step of what we do. It's like creating an engagement inside the site, because I can drive traffic to your site with a very broad keyword, right? I can even maybe buy some traffic from other sources. I mean, Google does that. Why shouldn't a publisher buy traffic on a broad term that doesn't cost much? But can then does the publisher have, the capabilities and the knowledge graph that is required for driving the user experience from that point on, and letting the users find what it's looking for? Because that's the point.
Right.
That's the point of your data.
I remember about, 10 or 15 years ago, having this insight that SEO and UX were the same thing, that they were this relentlessly user-focused practices designed to satisfy user intent and to give people what they want and to help them accomplish the tasks they want to do or learn what they want to do. And to what you just said, hey, but a couple things you just said, you've mentioned several times now, schema.org. And schema is both a generic term that is a way to organize stuff, I guess. And schema.org is a particular open source project kind of led by Google, or led by a consortium with Google as a major contributor. Can you talk a little bit about schemas and schema.org? Yeah.
So, well, schema is a generic term for describing the way in which data is organized. But schema.org, it's called the linked data vocabulary. So it's a vocabulary expressed in the format of linked data that allows machine to describe the things of the world. So this is a person, and that is a person, and whatnot. So it's a linked data vocabulary. It's a way in which we can unambiguously label things. Okay. So schema.org is an initiative. It's open source. It runs on GitHub. It's a W3C community, but yes, search engine has a major role, and Google among the search engine has invested the most, because it's driving the AI first experience that Google has been investing on in the last years. So after mobile first, as you said, we are into artificial intelligence first mode, and so the investment on data is the result of these kind of change of the user experience. So the user interface now, it's the AI. So how do you feed the AI with structured data or semantic rich data? And schema.org, it's the language that we use for conveying these meanings. Now, there are, in the world of the semantic web, there are hundreds of different languages and vocabularies and ontologies that we can use to describe the things that we care. So schema is only one of these hundreds of vocabulary, but it's the one that has been more successful because it's been the one used by commercial search engine and Google in particular.
Right.
So is there something wrong with that? I don't think so.
No, it's interesting. And I'm curious about that, between the relationship between like schema.org, and then there's other more like commercial ontologies and taxonomies that are like standardized and specified, and things like ANSI and ISO and other standards bodies like that. How does schema.org interact with those kinds of organizing schemes?
Well, I mean, the idea of structured content, it's very broad, right? You can use, whatever XML format you like in order to organize the content inside your CMS. And there are plenty of standards for creating a content model that works for your content. And that's, I think, where everything starts. So you start by organizing content and creating a content model that is effective for the purpose of the work that you're doing as a publisher. Now, schema is simply, if you want, an output format for expressing this content model to agents outside of your site. So it's a shared vocabulary that allows you to kind of express the content model, which is made of different elements connected together, to the outer world. Now, in the way in which we approach it, then we say, hey, why don't we use it to structure the content? So why don't we bring it back, not just see it as an output, but we see it as an input. So we start creating the content model using schema. Now, this has several limitations because, of course, schema is meant to describe things that are commercially relevant for organizations like Google. So I think as of today, it's very hard to describe the life of your pet, which might be extremely relevant, but has very little commercial importance for search engine. And so it becomes very hard to, you can, of course, describe the different breeds of a pet, but, the pet itself, it's not well curated in the vocabulary. There are other vocabulary that you can introject into your project in order to better describe the life of your pet. But, business-wise, schema is a very simplified way in which we can describe the world. It is limited by the fact that Google is kind of as such a dominant role, but it's also up to us to come to the board and say, hey, I want to have, this pet ontology, because this is my business case, and it's going to be interesting not for me but for everyone. So the web scale, of course, it's important, and we have to create kind of a democratic approach to these, and the community has to be open and so on and so forth. But so schema is an output, but you can also see it as an input.
Got it. Yeah, and in fact, there's the whole world of like technical communications and content strategy there is, with structured authoring, where they're concerned with really highly structured content going in for the purpose of reuse in a CCM. Anyhow, that's a whole other conversation, but it's actually interesting to make sure that people get that there's a number of different ways that the term structured content is used. So, but hey, Andrea, I noticed we're already coming up close to. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we're doing an experiment with Simple A and Cruz Sanders right now, where we're trying to infer, the content model from an unstructured document, because the approach of a content strategy, it's always to start from the top. Whether the approach of someone like WordLift using NLP is to start from the bottom and try to look at the unstructured content that we have and try to infer the type of structure that you can derive from the content that you have produced over the years. So there is a lot of connecting dots between, the content structuring strategies and schema markup and SEO in general.
Interesting. Well, I'd love to. Well, is that work you're doing with Cruz, will that be published for general consumption, or is that just an internal project you're working on?
It's really at the moment an internal project, but let's see where we get. I think it's interesting because he has this very deep top-down approach, and I'm learning a lot from him in terms of how do we structure content and what does it really mean to structure content. Whether I have this very focus on what does the machine needs to understand in order to improve the findability, what is required for this asset to be found by different queries that can convert. So my approach is super simple. I have to think like a search engine. I have to think, what data the machine needs to provide more valuable traffic to this publisher.
Got it. Yeah. Hey, Andrea, I noticed we're coming up on time, and I always like to give my guests a chance. If before we wrap up, is there anything that's come up today that you want to elaborate on, or just that's on your mind about the semantic web or the open web? Or
I think one concept for all is build your knowledge graph. And if the motto was in the beginning, raw data now, and we started with these, I think personal knowledge graph, it's the motto that everyone should think through.
Oh, that's good. And I just want to, if I remember correctly, I think he actually said demand raw data now. He was like pretty vociferous about it. And I think I'm guessing you would have a similar urgency about people building their own knowledge graphs.
Totally.
All right, great.
Build your graph. Build your graph. Don't wait for Google to build the graph about you. Build the graph before Google does.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Andrea. I really appreciate the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks to you.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.